Welcome to Global Connections with Robert Siegel, presented by the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center. Our monthly Leaders Forum addresses vital issues facing society, the economy, real estate, medicine, technology, and science. My name is Dr. Joshua Plow. I'm the Executive Director of American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, a 501c3 National American charitable organization based in New York City. We at AFRMC represent Israel's premier hospital, Rabin Medical Center in Petah Tikva and Greater Tel Aviv, the leading institution named in honor of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. The hospital is a model of coexistence, as it serves 1 million patients annually from all ethnic and religious backgrounds with the same compassionate care. And now, during this time of war, the hospital, as a front line of Israel's defenses, treats the many wounded Israeli soldiers and civilian casualties. We remain in awe of the doctors and nurses at Israel's Rabin Medical Center in the ER, ICU, and orthopedic departments as they respond to the October 7th atrocities. Please support our mission. Join our community of friends. Visit American Friends of Rabin Medical Center via our website and social media outlets on Twitter and Instagram, LinkedIn and YouTube, and on our Facebook page and discussion group. Today's Global Connections topic is how the Gaza war changed the Middle East. Thank you to our very special guest, David Makovsky, Director, Near East Policy Project on the Middle East Peace Process at the Washington Institute. Lucy Kurtzer-Ellenbogen, Director, Israeli-Palestinian Conflict Program at the U.S. Institute of Peace. And Ghaith al-Omari, Senior Fellow, the U.S.-Israeli Strategic Relationship at the Washington Institute. And now, Global Connection with Robert Siegel.
Thank you, Josh. It is now nearly a year since Hamas attacked southern Israel, murdering civilians, taking hostages, and setting off a war that is still in progress. Over that time, the war has expanded to involve Iran somewhat, and Iran's clients and allies, even more so, Hezbollah to Israel's north in Lebanon, and even the Houthi movement in Yemen. It's also led to more violence by and against Palestinians on the West Bank. We don't know how this war will end, and agreement on a prolonged ceasefire and a big hostage release has eluded negotiators led by the United States. As for what happens after the war does end, there's a lot of talk, but questions outnumber answers. What role, if any, would Hamas play in Gaza? Who would rebuild Gaza? And who would guarantee that no Hamas 2.0 would reestablish itself and arm itself under cover of reconstruction? Also, can Israel's normalization with Sunni Arab states advance without some credible commitment on Israel's part to a two-state solution? And are Israelis more or less inclined to make such a commitment after this war? We've invited three very knowledgeable panelists to talk about how the war is changing the Middle East and how the conflict might conceivably come to a close. Our first panelist is David Makovsky, who is now a fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. David's areas of expertise include Arab-Israeli relations and U.S.-Israel relations. He's an author, former journalist, edited the Jerusalem Post, and wrote for the Israeli paper Haaretz, also for the American magazine U.S. News and World Report. After years of writing about the Middle East peace process in 2013 and 2014, he actually took part in it, working for then Secretary of State John Kerry's attempt to midwife an Israeli-Palestinian settlement. David Makovsky, welcome once again.
Delighted to be with you, Robert.
And I guess I should mention that Kerry mission that you were part of was really directed by the late Martin Indyk, who is no longer with us and who's
passed away.
Passing. We grieve for. First, let me ask you this: is there actually a workable plan somewhere of what would happen in Gaza if Sinwar, the Hamas leader, and Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, were in fact to reach some sort of an agreement?
Well, it's a very good question, and I'm sorry that the answer is not as good as the question. There are plans, plural, that are out there, but there's no agreed upon plan that all the parties can agree to. Basically, everyone would, I think, would like that for the new government to be decent, to help involve in the reconstruction of Gaza, to be a stabilizing force, and maybe even would, create the seeds of better Palestinian governance. Prime Minister Netanyahu, though, was part of a coalition where two of the members on the right in particular, and they have 14 of the 64 seats, you need 61 to govern.
In the Knesset, that is.
In the Knesset, in the Israeli parliament. And those two hard right parties, do not want to hear the word Palestinian Authority. If anything, their finance minister is trying to stop funds to going to the PA in the West Bank. I think everyone knows it would be a little messy in that, like in the West Bank, there would, you have the PA, the Palestinian Authority, and let's say 39% of the land. Area A, the Palestinian urban areas, and the environs, right outside those areas, called Area B. It would probably be somewhat analogous in the beginning as if you could have the PA set up in the West Bank, in Gaza, so that kind of hybrid would kind of replicate itself. But the prime minister, says he doesn't want to hear the word PA. Is he doing it because these other guys are threatening to kind of hold him by the throat and bring down his government? Or does he think that de-radicalization, as he calls it, is best done outside of a PA framework? The fear that I have is if there's not an agreed upon framework, there's chaos, there's Somalia, there's a vacuum, and the people who will fill that are Hamas will try to reconstitute. What people are trying to do is to see if there's some sort of international wrapping with the Emiratis and the Egyptians to help midwife kind of this new entity. And, and that would be something that I think people think in theory would be good, but it gets down to some very tricky questions, like if Hamas does fight against this new entity, who stops Hamas? What is the security component? And where's Israel in that mix? And, if anything, Israel is seen as too embracing, will that taint it? And, and so there's no real agreed upon framework. I think some sort of Gaza Reconstruction Authority is needed. It should have a relationship to the PA, but the politics right now are not allowing it. And I worry the vacuum is going to actually serve Hamas because of people, like I said, Somalia or Hamas people will go to Hamas. And that to me is worrisome.
But does that mean that we have to, even if Hamas is greatly degraded, which I assume it must be after the amount of time that Israeli Defense Forces have been in Gaza, that they are a party that has standing in negotiations? I mean, this is still, Sinwar is still a person to be reckoned with and has to sign on to some future agreement about Gaza.
Well, this is the question. I mean, the way whenever people said, what is the goal? Sometimes in the beginning they will say, well, they want to destroy Hamas. And people say, you can't destroy an idea. And then people say, no, we want to topple them for power. So if there is a new governing authority, it would not be, vetoed by Hamas. So how, what is Hamas's role? But I feel that there's not a real security apparatus to protect this very fragile entity. In the Middle East, sometimes the people who fire the shots call the shots. And that would give Hamas the veto that nobody wants them to have. But it's upsetting that what's known as the day after planning has been stymied, and the defense establishment, Israel, desperately wants to do this and work with the Emiratis and the Egyptians and the Palestinian Authority, in my mind, but the politics are not allowing it, and the net effect is a stagnation that I worry is dangerous because of these implications of what a vacuum would mean. It would only benefit Hamas.
Let me ask you about another player in the region, Iran. One reading of Iran's numerically massive rocket attack on Israel that was completely repelled by Israel and allies, including the United States. One reading has been that Iran doesn't regard a war as advisable now. Of course, now also includes these remarkable attacks on Hezbollah operatives through their pagers and walkie-talkies, which is a new front, I guess, in the war. Is there still a threat of an Israeli-Iranian war, or a war that the United States is dragged into with Iran? And was the intention, say, of the attack on the pagers to provoke a war with Iran?
Fair question. Look, I think what happened on April 13th, 14th, 13th if you're in the U.S., 13th, 14th if you're in Israel and the Middle East, was a remarkable moment in the history of the modern Middle East, where you had suddenly this broad-based coalition of the U.S., France, Britain, Israel, and silent partners, Jordan and Saudi Arabia, all seeking to come together and thwart over 300 projectiles, whether they were ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, or drones. And it wasn't just a one-time like pro forma thing, but over 300 projectiles. I mean, I don't think there have been that many ballistic missiles fired at any country at one time like there has been here. So I think it was somewhat a glimpse into what could be a new Middle East future in a good way, of a kind of an anti-Iran coalition, including Sunnis, including Israelis, including Europeans and Americans. And I think the head of CENTCOM, General Kurilla, was kind of the conductor of this symphony. And that I think is something that we should see that in a good way. I mean, we could talk for hours and hours if that coalition was essential, or was it something Israel could have done on its own. But it's clear to me that having all these countries there gave you a thicker coverage, that if Israel was by itself, more projectiles would have gotten through. I think there's no way to argue that. Now, what happened, fast forward the tape, Robert, to the summer after the killing of Hania, the assassination of the Hamas leader at a VIP guest house in Tehran. People wondered if Iran was going to war. Israel was also retaliating against 12 children of the Druze community who were very much involved in Israeli combat, but of their children that were killed on a soccer field. And people wondered if this like 1-2 punch would mean that Iran would do a regional war. And what we saw was the United States once again stepping in and with General Kurilla, and you had 2 aircraft carriers in the region. And the net effect was that you had a situation where Iran was deterred. There were 40,000 American servicemen in the Middle East. Yes, Hezbollah retaliated, but the fact that Iran was deterred, I think what we hear from the intel space was that Iran told Hezbollah, listen, we're not in this. You're on your own if you attack. Yeah. And Iran's response was restrained. So I think Iran is deterrable. I don't think that precludes that there could be another round of confrontation. You never say never. And look, the fact that you have 7 fronts in this conflict, this was Qasem Soleimani, the head of the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, Al-Quds Force. This was his brainchild, the idea of a ring of fire around Israel using Iranian proxies. Sinwar hoped that he would light the match to this ring of fire on October the 7th. And you could say on one hand, there's 7 fronts, but it's not of the intensity that he would have liked. So I think you're right to raise the Iran angle. But I think Iran has shown that it is very much cognizant of U.S. deterrent capabilities.
Well, we'll return to the subject of Iran in the Q&A session. But for now, David, I want to thank you and stand by as we turn to our next panelist, Lucy Kurtzer-Ellenbogen, who joins us now. Lucy Kurtzer-Ellenbogen works at the U.S. Institute of Peace, where she directs the program on Israel, the Palestinian territories, Egypt, and the Levant. She formerly worked at the Department of State, and she is the co-author of a, I believe, soon-to-be-published book on the diplomatic efforts of successive U.S. administrations to deal with the Arab-Israeli conflict. Lucy, welcome back. Good to talk with you.
Thank you.
When we spoke recently about how things are changing in the region, you observed that the war in Gaza and the Hamas attack that led to it have upended a lot of assumptions about the Middle East and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and also clarified some things about it. So I'd like to hear from you more about that. First, what are the assumptions that have been upended?
Yeah, so thank you. I mean, I think there's several dynamics going on and several, as you said, I see this really as an era of upended assumptions, and also in relation to much of what David was discussing, unclear rules of engagement, which have been part of those assumptions over many years. And, the challenge with that, I think, is that it makes the different actors that we're talking about, their calculations of what it means to establish deterrence, I think it makes that very unclear. And I think we're seeing some of that play out. So to your specific question of what are some of those assumptions, I mean, of course, if we go to October 7th, the initial large-scale upended assumption, one of those certainly seemingly on the Israeli calculation part, was that Hamas was not looking for this kind of fight. There had definitely been that kind of assessment. Eyes were very much on the northern border threat from the Israeli perspective, to the east, to the West Bank. So, of course, one upended assumption there. I think, David just was speaking about what happened in April when Iran fired at a barrage of projectiles at Israel, sort of that assumption that Iran would take the direct fight, maybe that the Houthis had either the capacity or will to join and disrupt in the way they had. And of course, lurking, I think, behind all of this is this assumption maybe that not everybody, I think there's been this tension in the analysis for many years, and that regional integration, regional normalization, the march towards that meant that we actually could upend the old assumption that you needed to address the Israeli-Palestinian arena before you had that kind of regional integration. And I think we can question, I always like to refer to David's analysis in this. I think back in 2020, when we looked at the emergence of these Abraham Accords and the march to normalization, one of the questions, as David framed it, and I think it's still the most apt framing I've heard, is would those be a bridge to resolving the Israeli-Palestinian issue or a bypass road around it? And I think that assumption that maybe you could move towards some stability in the Middle East without addressing that core issue has been upended by the 7th. The last thing I'd say on that, of course, all of these upended assumptions have a counter, maybe. I think when you look at what David was just describing, the regional response, when Iran did hit Israel in April, and you had the response from the partners, some of those old normalizers, Jordan, and the new normalizers, that probably tested some assumptions that Iran had as well about with the growing anger around this prolonged war in Gaza, how much would these Arab normalizing partners be able to be seen to be sticking their neck out? So again, a whole host of assumptions to unpack and upended assumptions, but I think it's what leads to so much of this uncertainty that we're seeing.
Yes. I mean, diplomacy is conducted by diplomats who work for national governments, which are led by politicians. But a stable peace also involves a buy-in by the societies that are represented by those governments. And how do you suspect Israeli and Palestinian society are being changed by this war?
Well, I think they've been affected certainly deeply. That goes without saying. I think that The idea that this is minimally a generational setback is very resonant. I think what you've seen starting on October 7th, in terms of the way each side, the Israelis and Palestinians, are processing this trauma to their societies, is very much a throwback to traumas, to their historic traumas, right? You heard, in October 7th, the experience for many Israelis was described as, this is like seeing the pogroms, what happened in the kibbutzim. It's like another Holocaust. You see the Palestinians hearkening back to, this is like the Nakba all over again, their defining historic tragedy. And I think that each side is so mired so deeply in their trauma and the victimhood to these circumstances, that it has set back, really, certainly for now, the ability to conceive of a future that involves the other in anything other than a sort of a zero-sum kind of equation. There was actually, the most recent joint poll that was done of Israeli and Palestinian society. There hadn't been one for a while, by Khalil Shakaki and Dalia Shendlin. They've done this regularly over time. But the most recent one really underscored this in very stark terms. It is, for many years, people have observed that the Israeli and Palestinian societies are mirror images of each other in terms of how they process the narrative of this conflict. And it is so stark right now, including sort of processing of, if you ask Israelis, their sense of, what was October 7th? It was an attempt at a genocide. If you ask Palestinians, what is happening, you're getting the same kind of answer. There's this sort of mirroring that's happening that I think bodes very ill for the trajectory of societal buy-in.
David Makovsky spelled out, I thought, the vagueness of the state of a solution right now in diplomacy. So, which leads me to wonder why is the fighting still going on? I mean, when you think about what goes on in the mind of Benjamin Netanyahu or Sinwar, for that matter, what would each person see as worth still fighting for at this point? The Israelis seem to have done grave damage to Hamas, perhaps not as much as they would like, but they don't seem to be likely to recover a great many living hostages this way. Hamas is not doesn't seem to be won over the hearts and minds of Gazans by this war. Why, apart from the absence of a good way to end it, why is the fighting still going on?
Yeah, well, I won't presume to get into the heads of either of these individuals, but I do think there's been some element, almost maybe ironically and tragically, of course, is the longer this has gone on, the more there's a buying of time, almost. The more that the stakes and the calculation of action or inaction, or where your respective leverage is to the other side, is probably changing on a regular basis. So I think that, for Israel, from an Israeli leadership calculus, perhaps there certainly has been a degrading of Hamas, but as we see, there's still Sinwar is still there and still able to call the shots. And again, I go back to what I said at the beginning, that I think that the real challenge here that I think all of these leaders and players are dealing with is with this upending of assumptions and this sort of testing of each side's red line that's going on. The longer this goes on, and the longer that the rules of engagement are not those of the past or what was expected, I think each side is still trying to understand what is that? What is going to deter? What is going to be that point? And so, for Sinwar, I would imagine there was probably some hope earlier on that there may be more of a joining of the fight by his Iranian-supported allies in arms. So you've seen attempts by these parties, whether it's the Houthis and Hezbollah, to nominally join the cause, but only go so far, right? Not want to be dragged in quite to the same extent, but to tie what they're doing to what is happening in Gaza. And, that didn't happen at the same time. The longer this has gone on, and now as you see the potential for more flaring between Lebanon, between Hezbollah and Israel, perhaps there's a calculation by Sinwar. He may have nothing else to lose at this point, right? That could end up distracting. You play for time. Again, I can't, the psychoanalysis of each is beyond me, but I just don't think either. I guess I would end by saying if the goal and the vision for what next isn't clear for either side, again, any path will get you there if you don't know where you're going. I think that there's no clear winning endpoint for either of them at this point.
Thanks, Lucy. And stay with us because we're going to have all three of you together in a few minutes. But first, our third panelist, Ghaith al-Omari, is, like David Makovsky, I should add, a fellow at the Washington Institute on Near East Policy. Ghaith al-Omari held various positions within the Palestinian Authority and in the peace negotiations that were led by Bill Clinton toward the end of his presidency. Ghaith, in fact, was an advisor to the Palestinian delegation in those negotiations. He also used to be executive director of the American Task Force on Palestine, which advocates for a two-state solution. Hi, Ghaith. How are you?
Great.
When we spoke the other day, and you were confronted with the topic of change in the region, you promptly ticked off three areas of change. So let me ask you to do it for a few other people right now. Let's start with the change in Palestinian politics.
Look, first of all, thank you, Robert. Always great to be with you and to be with two good friends. If you look at one of the objectives of why Hamas and Sinwar did what they did on October 7th, one of the objectives was to basically emerge as the primary political address for the Palestinians. It's the exact same tactics and strategy used by the PLO back in Al-Fatah back in the 1960s. So I think part of it is certainly, at least at the moment, Hamas is emerging as the political and diplomatic address. You see it politically in opinion polls where, at least maybe not in Gaza, but certainly in the West Bank, its popularity is rising. But also diplomatically, even though no one is recognizing Hamas, everyone's trying to talk to Hamas. And this is the nature of all of these hostage negotiations, etc. So that's kind of one level. On the other hand, the Palestinian Authority, which was already ailing, which already had a legitimacy deficit, has proven itself to be completely useless. I mean, it's an afterthought in diplomacy. It's unpopular among its public. It does not present any meaningful initiative. This is, if you want to take a snapshot of today. I think as we look forward, things will be even messier. The Palestinian Authority will continue, I believe, unless it really gets its act together in terms of governance, in terms of initiative, in terms of corruption, etc. It will continue to decline. But also Hamas. Today, everyone's rallying around Hamas because of it's a rally around the flag moment during war. Yet Palestinians are, particularly in Gaza, but I expect more, are starting to ask themselves, why did you bring this calamity on us? Today, there is no Gaza. If you look at it, the term I always hear is moonscape. It looks like flattened. People are asking Hamas, is it worth it? Particularly when Hamas is all it's asking in these ceasefire talks is a return to the status quo ante, to October 6th. So I think all of this happens. And then at a more, and here I will harken back to something that Lucy said. This is October 7th and the aftermath have unveiled or flared up deep traumas in both societies, Jewish vulnerability on the Israeli side, and on the Palestinian side, what we're seeing is a real disintegration of the social fabric in Gaza. It's not the same society that we knew, whether in terms of trauma, in terms of loss, etc. This inevitably will have implications. My main concern, and I will conclude with this, is that after this major shock, when you have such fragile political structures in the West Bank and Gaza, you might end up with a collapse of the Palestinian national movement, with a vacuum that will never work well for anyone involved.
Second point you have raised when we spoke privately was regional changes, and it's now inescapable to everyone in the region that however messy the Palestinian situation may become, it just can't be ignored.
Oh, absolutely. And I think this is a point that also Lucy mentioned.
Yes.
Before all of this, I remember conversations back in September of last year, in August, etc., about the Saudi-Israeli normalization. And, how much of a fig leaf do you really need when it comes to the Palestinian issue? It was seen as an afterthought. Right now, what we have seen is that the Palestinian issue has the ability to be mobilized, at least, and used in a way that can disrupt the whole region. I mean, look at the map. Red Sea navigation badly impacted with implications for Jordan, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. There are so many open fronts, I don't know where to start. When you get to a point where Jordan is bombing Syria, which is happening occasionally, that things are getting messy in that region. The South Palestinian issue, everyone recognizes, has become, it's a reminder that it's very important. And we see this, people talk about Saudi-Israeli normalization and talk about MBS, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, using this only almost as kind of speak to his public kind of thing. I think there's more than that. There's a strategic sense that it matters. But, and there's an important but, while everyone realizes it matters, I am yet to see anyone who actually has a clear idea of what to do about it.
Yeah.
Everyone still believes in a two-state solution, but everyone knows this is not going to happen anytime soon. So what is viable, given the realities, both in Israel, given the current Israeli government and coalition, but also in the Palestinian scene, given the unpalatability of Hamas and the total ineptitude of the Palestinian Authority?
The third change that you mentioned to me before was the view that a new generation in Arab countries is taking of Israel, and it's not positive.
It's actually not only of Israel; it's of the whole conflict. I mean, I've been a few times to the Middle East over the last year, and a constant theme that I hear is the following, especially when I speak to young people. I hear that this was, before October 7th, I used to think that this was my parents' problem. I couldn't really most young people had no personal relation to this conflict. They treat it, I guess, the way that, my generation treats the Kennedy assassination. An interesting thing that happened in the past. But for seeing what you see right now, and particularly, I have to preface this by saying, when you go to the Arab world, when you watch Arab media, and this is true across the spectrum of Arab media, what you see primarily are the destruction in Gaza, dead babies, these kind of, that one side of the reality, a very real side, but only one side of the reality. So what you hear is people are saying, before October 7th, I thought that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict was basically a relic of the past. Today, I will never forgive Israel. This is a theme that you hear. And not only do you hear it, by the way, among, your average Joe, your average Muhammad, you hear it when you talk to young officials. I mean, I talk to young Jordanian, Saudi, Egyptian, even Emirati officials whose view of this conflict is being shaped by this. So before October 7th, we were coming at a time of convergence, at a time of basically looking at what are the benefits of integration. And while I do believe that this remains the overarching view of the kind of political, diplomatic, military establishments in the region, it's becoming harder because their own publics and their own staffs are becoming more angry. And I think this is creating complications that we will unfortunately have to deal with once things calm down, and once we move to the, what you started asking David about, the day after, and how do we manage that both on the Gaza level, but on the wider regional level.
What if in fact there is a negotiated end to this to the fighting? What becomes of Sinwar and Hamas? Do they remain as a disarmed political faction in Gaza? Is there something in the works or imagined in the works, like the deportation of the Palestinians from Beirut to Tunis, where the leadership of Hamas all decamps to I don't know where? what would happen to them? And they're not all going to be killed by Israel between now and whenever the war ends.
I mean, this is really the major question, and it's unanswerable right now. I mean, let me start maybe with Sinwar himself. It is very hard for me to see how this war is going to end when Sinwar is still alive and at large. He has become not only a symbol of the war vis-a-vis the Israelis, but he's also the one right now controlling Hamas and representing the most kind of absolutist voice within Hamas. It's hard for me to see how it's going to end. Now, in the larger picture, though, I think, today, and this again builds on what Lucy said, today Hamas believes that time is on its side. Sinwar believes that time is on its side. They don't believe that they are losing. And they have a case. They have a case if they look at the internal tensions within Israel, and they say, look, Israel is imploding. They look at the potential of the other fronts opening up, whether it is Iran, which, is still, we're waiting to see how they're going to react to the assassination of Haniyeh, whether it is Lebanon, whether it's the West Bank, etc. They look at their competition in the Palestinian scene, the Palestinian Authority, and they see it slumping. They look at the international position vis-a-vis Israel and the conduct of the war. So they look at themselves, the situation right now as in their time is on their side, particularly that, the spoiler role that David mentioned early on and a day after doesn't require a particularly high level of armament and sophistication. It's enough to have enough AKs and enough ARs to shoot a few peacekeepers to make sure that it all collapses. So the threshold for being a spoiler is quite low. All of this put together, right now, Hamas has zero interest in alternative. How do you change their calculus? I believe in two ways. A, they have to feel that militarily time is on their side, but B, there has to be a credible alternative. And this is why I always go back to the point of the Palestinians have to work on reforming, fixing the Palestinian Authority, and the Israelis have to start delivering deliverables if the Palestinian Authority acts in ways that are responsible, which often it does, despite all of its kind of, let's say, annoying behavior elsewhere.
All right, al-Omari, thanks for your contribution. Stick with us because I'd like to bring back David Makovsky and Lucy Kurtzer-Ellenbogen now for our question and answer session. And I'd like to begin with a question about the region to all three of you, which is about Iran. We've heard, you've discussed already the idea that Iran is not interested in leaping into the conflict, or at least it's been of two minds. It may be that Israeli actions are goading them into doing so. If you were in Tehran right now, would all of this add up to, in your view, an important sign that the nuclear program should go full speed ahead and develop the ultimate deterrent, which would be a nuclear weapon? Or would the unity that was witnessed around Israel when the rocket attacks were staged suggest to you that there really would be a deterrent to Iranian use of a weapon if it had one? Let me begin by asking David: Does this argue, if in Iranian terms, in terms of speeding up a nuclear program? Or
on one hand, there's no doubt the world has been distracted and will continue to be distracted with the U.S. election until a new president has come in and they name their people. There's kind of a limbo rhythm in Washington till maybe the summer of 2025. So if you're an Iranian, you see a vacuum. So maybe, yes, you're right. And certainly since October 7th, there's been much less focus, publicly at least, on the Iran nuclear program, given all the turmoil of the Middle East since October 7th. On the other hand, Iran seems to like it both ways. They seem to like being like what we would call in kind of Washington think tank terminology, a nuclear threshold state, which is maybe a few screwdrivers away. The weaponization program of the device is not yet certain. Yes, it only takes them a blink of an eye, like 12 days, according to testimony, Biden administration officials if they want to go from what's called 60% to 90% enrichment. But the enrichment is not enough to have, that's the nuclear fuel, but then you have to actually have a device. Now, it's a little bit a double-edged sword because for Iran to go all the way, you could say, well, it's a fait accompli. There's not much focus on them. Why not? But on the other hand, a lot of sanctions, a lot of other things. I think they feel that there's a kind of a murkiness of them. People think, well, they might have it. They're close enough. And the weaponization program is unclear that people will assume they have it. So it becomes like a diplomatic shield, like, well, they might have it, so we have to be careful. And yet there's not proof that they have it. So they're not eligible for all the sanctions. So I think this kind of middle ground serves them, this idea of being a threshold state. But can I guarantee they won't sprint to the finish line? No, I cannot guarantee that.
Lucy, any thoughts on Iran and nuclear questions reacting to what's happened?
No, I think agree and underscore. I think what David just described. I mean, I think for Iran, and they are fairly sophisticated on some level at this, there's a game of three-dimensional chess always going on, and it goes back to this question I said of how do you calculate? How are these actors now calculating what deterrence means? I think there is, whether it's with the nuclear program, but also with things such as, are they going to respond to the Haniyeh assassination? They tend to like to preserve this, we'll respond at the time and place of our choosing, sort of dangling the uncertainty, whether that's a face-saving method to sort of allow them to not respond because they don't want to, or whether it has a psychological deterrent effect. I think that's always the question. I think it equally applies to the nuclear threshold question, as David says, as it does to how it'll respond to, to what you saw yesterday vis-a-vis its proxy Hezbollah, and also the Haniyeh assassination, which in theory, technically, we're still waiting to see what that response
what the response would be for that. Ghaith, any thoughts on Iran and the nuclear program?
Actually, I don't have much to add on the nuclear, but I do want to highlight the other aspect of Iran, which doesn't, in my mind, get enough play, at least in the Washington conversation, which is the Iran use of its proxies. I mean, understandably, obviously, we focus on the nuclear. That's a game changer. Yet, in the meantime, actually, this war has given Iran the ability to deepen and strengthen its regional position. If you look around the map now, I mean, okay, Hezbollah has already taken over the Lebanese state, but we see new Iranian proxies actually becoming more established. The Houthis now are becoming the new Hezbollah in terms of capabilities, control over Yemen, etc. We see them in their own minds, at least, feeling that they're winning in Iraq and Syria. I mean, all the talk here, which seems the center of gravity now in the States, is that we're going to leave Iraq and possibly Syria. You see them trying to open up new fronts. I mean, they've been pushing Jordan, whether in terms of messaging and in terms of smuggling of weapons and some of the terrorist capabilities. So we see all of this, and Iran is approaching that. And so far, I have to say, a lot of the, it's a grim joke and maybe a sick joke that we have in the policy world. But, Iran is happy to fight until the last Arab. And as long as it doesn't see that it itself is paying a price for all of this strategically important behavior via the proxies, then they see no reason not to continue with what they see as a winning strategy.
Has Hamas been, or will it be, degraded to the point where another entity can effectively establish order in Gaza without Hamas sabotaging it? We've addressed some issues surrounding this, but who has thoughts on whether the degradation of Hamas forces will be sufficient to make it possible for somebody else to be in charge?
Okay, sorry, Lucy.
No, go ahead.
The answer is no, it has not been. I mean, the objective of the current phase, the stated Israeli objective of the current phase of the war is to dismantle Hamas's military capabilities. And that has been done. Hamas as kind of an organized military formation no longer exists. We're hearing this actually coming a lot from the IDF itself, etc. But Hamas continues to have the capabilities and very strong capabilities as an insurgency. And we have seen, we the states have experienced this in Iraq. And dealing with an insurgency requires a very different approach, capabilities, tactics than dealing with military formation. Part of it is security oriented, and I suspect we'll see over the next month something similar to the West Bank as we see in Gaza. But part of it is in terms of how do you create, how do you hold territory, and how do you rebuild territory, and how do you create an alternative to the insurgency? And this was exactly the kind of logic behind the surge that we had in Iraq. And because of political reasons that David mentioned in Israel, right now, ultimately, who do you create as a governing alternative as you do the counterinsurgency is a question that Israel is unwilling to answer, putting us in this very awkward, strange position. But the short answer to the question is no, we're not quite there yet. And it's not, by the way, an on and off thing. You can have a phase in, phase out kind of situation where as more is done by the Israelis, as Hamas is weaker, as a new entity becomes more capable, you have less Israeli things. But the process has to start. And right now, I don't see the framework, political framework of the process starting.
Well, I'll move us on then to a question submitted by an anonymous viewer. Are there behind-the-scenes participants that the general public is unaware of that could shift the impact of the war in directions that are perhaps not yet obvious? Any surprise players who David Makovsky?
I think it's interesting to follow the Emiratis. They are the only Arab country that has kind of charted their own course. They actually have a dialogue with the prime minister's office in a way that the other Arabs don't. The other Arabs talk to the security apparatuses and other parts of the country, but not to the prime minister. And they invited Ron Dermer to Abu Dhabi.
Dermer, we should say, who used to be the Israeli ambassador here in Washington.
He's the U.S. ambassador. He's the right-hand person of the prime minister. He's now called Minister for Strategic Affairs. And he was there with Brett McGurk. And they have some interesting day after ideas. That's when you ask me, Robert, is there a plan? I say there are plans in the plural. And they want the kind of good governance that you will read in essays written by Rafe and Lucy and myself and Dennis Ross and others. They really want this. And they because they're invested in the peace with Israel, they understand how vulnerable they are if things, keep going the way they're going. Breaking news, while we are doing this very taping, it has come out that the Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed is going to be going to the White House on Monday for the first time since 2017, since the first year of the Trump presidency.
This is the effective leader of the
the effective leader of the UAE. And how much of it has to do with getting a pulse of Kamala Harris and maybe meeting President Trump, and how much of it is also trying to persuade the administration of some of its ideas. I don't know, but I think if you're looking for a wild card player, they are the one player that, some of the people have the will, but they don't have the capacity. Some have the capacity and they don't have the will. I think they are unique, that they have both, and that they are people that talk to all sides. And, it's no secret that they want a different, they want a PA that's more responsive. They feel that people always come to them, money, 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 money. And yet, if they don't have faith in the leadership, they feel the money could go down a sinkhole. So, this is, I think it's fascinating, and we'll see where this goes, what the MBZ visit portends. But I would follow them.
I'd like to hear thoughts from whoever has them about this moment in the United States. That is, there are two slices of time before us. One is the period between now and when we know who the next president of the United States is going to be, and then there's the the period of a lame duck presidency. I remember when Barack Obama was in the wings about to become president, there was a war in Gaza, and it was let's just say that the change of presidents offered a period in which people in the region could do as they liked. What might be the influence of the American political calendar and the content of American politics, for that matter, on this conflict between now and January? Who wants to? Lucy, do you want to try that, or?
I'll say something, although I feel poor David, when you mention that period of time, is probably having a little bit of PTSD around the involvement he was in the peace process at that time. There was a lot of dynamics playing out then. So I'll allow you to sit with that for a bit, David, while I offer a few thoughts on that. And I'll tie it to the previous question that David was answering, and the way anonymous attendee posed the question of the behind the scene participants. And I think, I think that, to go back to this chessboard analogy, I think we know who all the players are. There are these different actors, and as David said, what can be done will rely on finding that right combination and synthesis of who has the leverages and the capacity to bring to bear, to give everybody a little bit of what they need here in order to, whether it's climb down for the tree in some cases or start moving towards something more constructive. I think that in terms of all those players, whether it's the Emiratis, whether it's the Saudis, in terms of, we haven't talked much in this about the potential for will they, won't they normalize and what happened to that. I mean, we know what happened to it with October 7th, the question if it's still live. And I think what the American political calendar does is tells us pretty certainly, you never want to say never on anything, that between now and the election, the idea of big things happening sort of proactively is probably slim. That window between the election, again, we have an interesting situation that we don't usually have here, is that we have a president who is truly a lame duck president no matter what happens, because you're going to have a new candidate, whether it's Trump or whether it's Harris. So I think how you see all those players come together and the actions that may be taken or not taken in that period between the end of the election and who's next will very much depend. Again, you're going to be having these different players calculating, what does the next administration bring? I mean, I'm sure there's all sorts, in the same way that David said, there's all sorts of plans out there of what would day after plans in Gaza look like. I'm sure there's all sorts of thinking about what are actions that could be taken. But again, then we come back to what happened, when we go back to 2016, there was UN resolutions, there were attempts at the last minute by the incoming administration to sort of engage in that process. So I think we're in a bit of a waiting game on sort of proactive policy moves in relation to the election here. But I think we know who all the players are, all the players that can be constructive here. And as David said, I mean, there's a coterie of actors. I think the last thing I'd say is that on some level, I think the US needs to be the conductor of all these players. At the end of the day, there needs to be a coordinating actor to bring all these different pieces to bear. The Arab states, whether it's Egypt and Jordan or the Gulf states, can and will need to play probably a very constructive role in what will happen if we eventually get to a ceasefire and after that in Gaza. But they all have their conditions, as David has suggested, conditions of what they'd like to see the US do or what they need to see the Israelis do. And a lot of those conditions come back to this political horizon question, which, of path towards two states, which still seems to be this consensus view that we've come back around to among these players. So where that leaves the next president, whether it's a President Trump or President Harris, I think that's going to be one of the key questions.
I'll just add a couple of quick points here. I mean, one is, I think the most interesting scenario is if you have Harris elected, and then you have a Biden lame duck. because that's when he will be most probably powerful, freed of political constraints, yet at the same time with an administration that is likely to continue that. And in the past, we have seen these kinds of scenarios where presidents can do something very, very substantial. That's when Reagan started engaging the PLO in the lame duck between it. If you have a Trump presidency, then a Biden lame duck would be completely weak. But a point I want to underscore, a point that Lucy mentioned, which is a major question for both whoever wins, is, are we going to continue with deprioritizing the Middle East and therefore be unprepared to deal with it the way this administration was unprepared to deal with a crisis? Or will the next administration, no matter what, actually understand that even if you want to forget about the Middle East, you have to have a robust policy that deals with it and empowered personnel that can deal with that? I think that's a question that I have no answer to right now, but to me, this is the core question facing whoever wins the next elections.
If I can add, Robert, real quickly, I think what Raith said is really important about the lame duck period, as we call it, is shaped in no small measure by who wins the actual election. Like with Reagan, was asked by the Bush administration, like, Reagan, you have all this street cred with Israel because of the respect of Reagan and Schultz that were very seen as supportive of Israel. And basically, that's where Reagan and Schultz kind of used their final political credit to shape the US-PLO dialogue, really trying to help the George H.W. Bush administration.
Right. We should just say, for people who are not familiar with this, up until that point, the U.S., as a matter of principle, and deferring to Israelis, did not speak to the PLO.
Right. And so there would be, for example, if, and this is like, it seems like more of a Hail Mary than ever, given all the complexities that we didn't talk about it, there's going to be, a more flare up with Lebanon and Hezbollah. But if there was something with the Gulf, a lame duck that led into Harris would be the time to further that. And it has to do with the way the Senate is. And there would be a U.S.-Saudi defense treaty, which we haven't had time to get into.
No.
If it was a prelude to Trump, on the other hand, I could see, although my sources tell me that this came up in a meeting of the Prime Minister and Trump in Mar-a-Lago, that he said, well, after the election, I'd be much more open, no matter if I win or lose. Now, of course, this president never says he loses any election. But I think people, even who were very close to it, have their doubts that if he did win, he would want to put his own stamp on Abraham Accords 2.0. He wouldn't want the Abraham Accords to somehow be called the Joseph Accords. So I think how the lame duck is used is going to be a function of whether it's one friendly administration to another friendly administration or a kind of a rupture between administrations.
In the very little time that remains, let me put a short answer question to, if all three of you, if it's yes or no. Can you imagine there being a negotiated end to the war between Israel and Hamas without Benjamin Netanyahu being the prime minister who negotiates it for Israel and agrees to it? Is it implicit in the very idea of ending the war that must include Netanyahu? Thoughts, David? Yes.
I would just say it's dependent on two things: on either getting Sinwar or a hostage deal. And I tend to think that those are the two key variables. I know the rejoinder is going to be but the guy who's got to agree to the hostage deal is Netanyahu. But I see those two as the two things that will determine it. Lucy,
what do you think?
Yeah, I think those are the two determinants. And I think that the other point here is I don't yet see a political path in Israel that suggests Netanyahu's going anywhere anytime soon politically. So he is the leader who's there as it's the hand that's been dealt.
And Ghaith al-Omari?
Look, in the same way that I said, Sinwar feels that time is on his side. I think with the current Israeli political dynamics, Bibi feels that time is on his side. So whether it's Bibi or not, unless there's a shift in the current Israeli political dynamic, I don't see Bibi in his current iteration, frankly, having much of an interest on reaching a deal.
Well, thanks to all three of our guests, to Ghaith al-Omari, whom you just heard, Lucy Kurtzer-Ellenbogen, and David Makovsky. Also, many thanks to Joshua Plout and Roni Giuliano of the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, which produces Global Connections, and also thanks to our technical director, Bobby Grandone. I'm Robert Siegel, and this has been Global Connections, Navigating the New Normal. See you next month. Stay healthy and stay safe.